Chimamanda, a quiet 14-year-old girl, lived with her aunt Nkechi in Port Harcourt after her parents died in a tragic road accident. Her uncle had promised to care for her like his own child, but after a few months, he slowly handed over all responsibility to his wife. From the beginning, Aunt Nkechi treated Chima like a burden. She didn't see a grieving child, only an extra mouth to feed. Chima's daily life was filled with chores. She woke up early to sweep the compound, washed everyone's clothes, and scrubbed the floors while her cousins played or watched cartoons. When it came time to eat, she sat in the corner, waiting for leftovers. If the food wasn't enough, she simply drank water and went to bed. Her school life wasn't any better. She wore her older cousin's torn uniforms that were 2 sizes too big. Her school sandals were cracked at the sides, stitched up with thread to hold them together. But she never complained. She walked quietly, stayed out of trouble, and kept her pain to herself. But nothing hurt her more than Sundays. Church day. Every Sunday, the entire family dressed in their finest. Aunt Nkechi wore expensive lace. Her daughter Nkairu wore beautiful dresses and polished black shoes. But Chima? She was given worn-out clothes and the same old sandals, the ones with peeling soles and broken straps. No matter how she begged, she was told to wear what she had and keep quiet. Chima dreaded walking into the church because people always stared. The whispers, the judgment, the silent laughs. She wished she could disappear. But she followed anyway, keeping her head down, hiding her feet, and praying the service would end quickly. She walked behind them like a shadow, unnoticed, unheard. She was the girl who walked quietly, not just in church but through life. A girl no one saw. A girl carrying grief, rejection, and silence, all inside a pair of broken shoes. But she didn't know that one of those Sundays, everything would change. On that Sunday morning, Chima stood by the front door, quietly holding a pair of sandals in her hands. They were not just old, they were almost falling apart. The soles were worn thin, the leather straps had been stitched with black thread to keep them from breaking, and they were at least 3 sizes too small for her. Each time she walked in them, they made a loud, flapping sound, drawing attention she never wanted. She looked up at her aunt with pleading eyes and said softly, "Auntie Nkechi, please, can I wear Nkairu's old black shoes? They fit me better." Her aunt turned sharply, not even looking at her properly. "Do you think this is a fashion show?" she snapped. "If you like, don't go at all." Chima didn't respond. She had learned that arguing only brought more insults. Slowly, she bent down, slid her aching feet into the tight sandals, and stood up without a word. The pain was familiar now, and so was the silence. The rest of the family was already dressed in fine clothes. Nkairu wore shiny new shoes and a matching purse. Her younger brother had a well-ironed shirt and polished brown sandals. Aunt Nkechi adjusted her lace wrapper and sprayed perfume as they all walked out. Chima followed behind them, head bowed, careful not to walk too fast. With every step, the sandals made a soft slap against the concrete, reminding her of where she stood in the family. She walked like a shadow behind them, present, but not seen. She stayed quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because no one ever listened. Her feet hurt with every step, but her heart hurt more, not just from the shoes, but from how invisible she felt. She wondered if anyone at church would notice, or if they'd laugh like the last time. Still, she kept walking. She didn't know that those same sandals, those broken, painful, embarrassing sandals, were about to change her life in front of the entire church. Chima walked into the church behind her aunt and cousins, careful to stay a few steps back. They found seats near the back, far from the pulpit but close enough for everyone to see them as they entered. Chima kept her head low, praying silently that no one would notice her shoes. But that prayer went unanswered. As the choir began to sing, Chima felt the stares. First, it was a pair of teenage girls on the other side of the aisle. One of them nudged the other, tilted her head toward Chima's feet, and whispered with a smirk. The other looked and chuckled. Then she heard it. A boy behind her leaned toward his friend and muttered just loud enough, "See her shoe. Nah, that one day enter church." Her ears burned. She stared straight ahead, blinking fast, trying to stop the tears. Her cousin Kairu, sitting beside her, heard it too. She covered her mouth, giggled, then turned her face away like she didn't know Chima. Chima clenched her fists in her lap. She wished she could melt into the seat, disappear under the bench, or just run outside. But she sat still, quiet, unmoving. The choir finished, and the pastor stepped up. His voice filled the room with energy and power, but to Chima, it was distant. The only sound she truly heard was the slap of her sandals against her heel every time she adjusted her sitting. The loud flap echoed in her head like a drum. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest, her ears, her throat. She tried to focus on the sermon, but every few minutes, she caught another glance, another whisper, another chuckle. It wasn't just about shoes. It was shame. It was loneliness. It was that deep ache of knowing you don't belong, even in a house meant for healing. She wiped the corner of her eye and looked up at the cross above the altar, silently asking God if he saw her. If he did, would he say something? Would anyone? Because in that moment, she felt completely alone, even in a crowded church. Halfway through the sermon, Pastor Toby paused. His words stopped mid-sentence, and the microphone went silent. He scanned the crowd slowly, eyes sweeping across rows of faces. People shifted in their seats, wondering what had caught his attention. Then his gaze fixed on someone. Chima. He raised his hand and pointed gently. You, he said clearly. Yes, you, the young girl with the patched sandals. Please come forward. The whole church froze. The air went still. Heads turned. Whispers filled the room. Some gasped. Others leaned closer to see who he was pointing at. Chima looked up, confused. Was he really talking to her? Her eyes darted left and right, hoping he meant someone else. But Pastor Toby nodded. You, my dear. Don't be afraid. Come. Chima's body felt frozen. Her legs shook as she rose slowly from the wooden bench. Her aunt shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware that all eyes were now on them. Chima took her first step. The sound of her sandals, those loud, broken sandals, slapped against the tiled floor. One step, then another, each louder than the last. People stared, not just at her shoes, but at her. Some with curiosity, others with pity. She kept walking, heart pounding like a drum inside her chest. Her hands trembled by her sides, her eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. The closer she got to the altar, the heavier her steps felt. She reached the front, finally standing before the pastor, small and quiet. The stage lights above made her eyes blink fast. Her fingers clutched each other nervously. She could feel everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. She stood silently, not knowing why she was there or what would come next, only that something had just shifted. In that single moment, without understanding how or why, Chima knew something big was about to happen. Something that had nothing to do with her shoes, and everything to do with being seen, truly seen, for the very first time. Pastor Toby looked at Chima closely, his face kind and calm. He didn't rush. He allowed the silence to settle around them as the entire church waited. Then he spoke gently, microphone in hand. What's your name, my dear? Chima's voice was barely a whisper. Chim Amanda. He nodded slowly. And who do you live with? My auntie, sir. He looked into her eyes for a moment, then turned back to the congregation. Chim Amanda, he said softly. Do you know you are fearfully and wonderfully made? She gave a small nod, her eyes still down. He took one more step forward. Do you know that your value does not come from your clothes, your shoes, or what people say behind your back? Chima's lips trembled slightly. She bit down gently, holding back tears. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her. She nodded again, but it was clear the words were cutting deep. Not because they hurt, but because they spoke to something she had longed to hear for so long. Then Pastor Toby turned to the crowd, his voice rising slightly. Church, he said clearly. This young girl walked into God's house today with dignity, despite being treated with dishonor. The room shifted. There was a murmur, then a ripple of gasps. People looked at each other, at her, at the floor. Some eyes widened, others filled with guilt. The weight of those words settled across the room like a blanket. The same people who had whispered about her shoes just moments ago now sat in silence. Aunt Nkechi stiffened in her seat. She didn't look up. Her cousin stopped smiling. Chima stood there, frozen but calm, unsure what would come next. But something in her heart felt lighter, like someone had just opened a door. In just a few words, the pastor had taken her shame and turned it into something holy. And for the first time in a very long while, Chima felt like she wasn't just standing there in broken shoes. She was standing in truth. Pastor Toby turned back toward the crowd, his face serious but filled with warmth. He held up a white envelope in his hand. The entire church watched closely, sensing something important was about to happen. "I had planned," he began, "to bless a young person in the church today. I didn't know who it would be, but God just showed me." He looked back at Chima and smiled gently. Then, without hesitation, he placed the envelope in her small hands. Chima took it, unsure of what was inside. Her fingers shook slightly as she held it against her chest. He announced, "Inside is a check of 250,000 Nigerian nairas, for her school, her shoes, and her personal needs. It's a seed for her future." The entire church erupted into applause. The sound was loud, full of joy and surprise. Some stood up, others clapped with both hands raised. A few people even wiped their eyes. Chima's heart raced. She stared down at the envelope, still processing what had just happened. Back in the pews, Auntie Nkechi sat stiff. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide. For a moment, she stood halfway like she might go forward, like she wanted to be seen beside the blessing. But when people turned to look at her, she quickly sat down, adjusting her wrapper and folding her arms. Pastor Toby wasn't finished. He placed his hand gently on Chima's shoulder and said, "And from today, Chimamanda is under the church's mentorship. We will monitor her school, her health, and her future." There was a second wave of applause, this one even louder. Tears filled Chima's eyes and slid down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. She let them fall. Not because she was sad, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt chosen. Not pitted, not forgotten, chosen. She had come to church in broken sandals, expecting nothing but stares. And now, standing at the altar, she was holding a miracle. One she never asked for but deeply needed. Chima turned slowly from the altar, the envelope still clutched tightly in her hands. Her heart was pounding, but this time not from fear, from something she couldn't quite explain. She took the first step back to her seat, and the sound of her broken sandals echoed once again. But no one laughed. This time people clapped. As she walked, the same people who had whispered about her shoes were now watching her with wide eyes, nodding, even smiling. One woman leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "That girl's star is bright." Another man in the front row said, "God just lifted her." It was like the entire room had changed. Every step she took was still shaky, but no longer from shame. Her head was still slightly bowed, but now it was from overwhelming emotion, not fear. Her eyes didn't dare look up, but her heart felt something it hadn't felt in years: pride. She passed the teenagers who had giggled earlier. This time they didn't laugh. They looked away, silent. Her cousin Kairu stared straight ahead, face blank, unsure how to react. Chima reached her seat and sat down quietly. She placed the envelope carefully on her lap, holding it like it was something fragile, like it might disappear if she blinked. Her fingers wrapped around it gently, as if it was more than just paper. It was proof that someone saw her, that someone believed she mattered. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Inside, something was shifting, not just because of the money, not because of the crowd's attention, but because for the first time since her parents died, someone had spoken to her heart. Someone had looked past the dirt on her shoes, past the hand-me-down dress, and seen the girl underneath. She sat still, quiet, overwhelmed, but different, because this time, she wasn't the girl everyone overlooked. She was the girl who had been called forward, the girl who was no longer invisible, the girl who, at last, felt seen. When they got back home from church, the atmosphere was tense. No one spoke on the ride back. As soon as they entered the house, Auntie Nkechi went straight to her room without saying a word. Chima quietly placed the envelope on the small table in her corner and went to the kitchen to begin washing the plates from breakfast. Her hands were busy, but her heart was still full from everything that had happened. Minutes later, Nkechi stepped into the kitchen. Her voice was cold and sharp. "So you went there to disgrace me?" she said, eyes narrowed. "Making it look like I don't take care of you? Do you know how I felt sitting there while the whole church was looking at me like I'm wicked?" Chima didn't answer. She just looked down, scrubbing harder. Answer me. Kechi snapped again. Still, Chima stayed silent. Not out of disrespect. She simply had no words. She hadn't planned for any of it to happen. She didn't ask to be called out, or for a check, or for mentorship. She had just wanted to go to church. Kechi hissed and stormed off, slamming her bedroom door. Later that night, while the house was quiet, Chima sat in the corner of the sitting room, pretending to read a book. She could hear voices from her uncle and aunt's bedroom. First it was low. Then it got louder. You mean to tell me that girl has been going to church in torn sandals? Her uncle shouted. While you wear new ankara every Sunday and change wigs like water? There was silence. Then a weak reply from Kechi, too soft to hear. She's not even your daughter, and yet she's the one who got blessed, he continued. God sees everything. Chima paused. She didn't smile. But inside, she felt something shift. It was the first time she heard her uncle defend her. The first time someone challenged the way she was treated at home. And though nothing had changed yet on the outside, that night marked the beginning of something new. Weeks went by, and life started to look different for Chima. True to their word, the church stepped in. They arranged for her to leave the overcrowded public school and got her admitted into a better one with proper facilities. The first day she walked into her new classroom, wearing a clean uniform and shoes that actually fit, she felt nervous but proud. One of the kind deaconesses from church, Mama Grace, took a special interest in her. She took Chima shopping one Saturday. For the first time, Chima picked out her own shoes, not the ones thrown at her. She chose books she liked, notebooks with colorful covers, and a school bag that wasn't patched at the corners. The smile on her face that day stayed with her for weeks. At home, things started to shift slowly. Her uncle greeted her more often. Nkechi still gave her chores, but there was less shouting. There were awkward silences instead of insults. Chima didn't argue. She stayed quiet, steady, and focused on her new path. Despite everything, she never let the new attention change her heart. She remained humble, waking up early to pray, reading her Bible, and doing her homework with care. She was thankful, not proud. She began writing poems in a small journal Mama Grace gifted her. At youth fellowship, she read her first piece aloud. It was about pain, hope, and finding value beyond appearances. The hall clapped. One of the pastors even encouraged her to enter a church-wide essay competition. She did, and she won. Her piece was titled, "My Value Isn't in My Clothes," and it moved people to tears. It was shared in other churches. A small article about her win even appeared in the local newspaper, with her photo beside the headline. People began to see her differently, not just as the quiet girl with broken shoes, but as a voice, a light, a reminder that true worth comes from within. And though her life was still healing, one thing was clear: Chimamanda was not the same girl who had once walked to church in silence. Years later, Chimamanda Nwachukwu stood on brightly lit stages, dressed in simple but elegant clothes, with a confident voice that echoed through large halls filled with young people. She had become a youth motivational speaker, known across schools, churches, and community centers for her powerful words and humble heart. But behind her success was a story she never stopped telling, one that began with broken sandals. She dedicated her life to helping orphans and underprivileged children, especially those who felt invisible like she once did. She spoke to them about self-worth, dignity, and purpose. Her words weren't just inspiring, they were lived. People listened because they could feel the truth behind every sentence. Everywhere she went, Chima carried a message that grew from pain but blossomed into strength. She created workshops where girls were taught confidence, where boys were reminded that their background didn't define their future, and where children learned that kindness could change a life. But no matter how big the stage or how wide the crowd, she always shared one story: the moment in church when she walked to the front with patched sandals, afraid and ashamed, and walked back with honor and purpose. She never forgot that Sunday. She described how her aunt had shamed her, how whispers followed her like shadows, and how a pastor's simple act of seeing her changed everything. She held up those moments like a mirror for others to see their own value. And every time she ended her speech, she looked into the crowd, smiled softly, and said, "The same shoes they mocked became the steps that led me to destiny." So never let someone else's opinion define your worth. Because when man looks at your feet, God is preparing your crown. The room always went quiet, touched by the weight of her journey. Then came the claps, the tears, the hope. Chimamanda Nwachukwu, once the quiet girl in broken sandals, had become a voice for the forgotten. And Shien,